Princess Anne had finally done the one thing nobody inside that family believed she would ever do. She stripped Camilla of the last royal title still attached to her name, and she did it without raising her voice, without a press release, and without asking anyone's permission first. The decision landed inside Windsor within minutes, and by evening, even Charles could not find a single word to say about it. What triggered it was not a rumor. It was a document that had been sitting quietly inside a file connected to Andrew's ongoing scandal, waiting for the right person to finally read it properly. Before we go any further, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss where this story goes next. There are details in this one the palace never intended anyone outside those walls to see. But to understand why Anne was the one who finally pulled that thread, you have to go back more than 50 years to a wedding she sat through in silence, in a church in a hat with her face arranged into exactly the expression the institution required of her that day. It happened in a small private office on the ground floor at Windsor, the kind of room reserved for conversations nobody wants recorded in an official diary. Anne asked for 10 minutes. Camilla assumed it was routine, a scheduling matter, perhaps a small adjustment to an upcoming engagement. She had no reason to expect anything else because in 50 years, Anne had never once requested a private meeting outside of official business. She was wrong within the first sentence. Anne did not raise her voice. She has never needed to. She told Camilla plainly and without preamble that her remaining royal patronage, the last formal title still attached to her name after a string of quiet removals over recent years, was being withdrawn effective immediately. No committee vote, no formal announcement drafted, simply a decision delivered the way Anne delivers everything as a fact rather than a negotiation. Camilla did not respond right away. People who were nearby that morning, not in the room but close enough to sense the temperature change in the corridor afterward, describe her expression as somewhere between disbelief and fury, the kind of stillness that comes right before somebody finally loses their composure in private. She asked why. Anne, according to what has been quietly repeated since, said only that the reasons would become clear soon enough and that she would not be discussing it further that morning. That was the entire conversation, 10 minutes, most of it silence. What makes this moment so extraordinary is not the decision itself. Patronages, shift titles, get reassigned. That is the ordinary machinery of a working royal family. What makes it extraordinary is who made the decision and how quickly it happened. Anne does not act on impulse. In 70-plus years inside that family, she has built a reputation as the one member who moves only when she is completely certain, who never says anything. She has not already decided she is prepared to stand behind for the rest of her life. If Anne moved that morning, it was because something had finally reached a threshold she had been watching for a very long time. And the timing was not accidental. It landed within days of new material surfacing from the ongoing investigation into Andrew, material that had nothing to do with Camilla on the surface, buried in files most people assumed were irrelevant to anyone outside of Andrew's own case. Somebody read those files more carefully than the investigators expected anyone to, and what they found changed the entire shape of what Anne was willing to tolerate. Camilla left that meeting and went straight to find Charles. Multiple household staff describe her as visibly shaken, walking faster than usual, her voice raised for the first time in longer than anyone could remember. She wanted him to intervene. She wanted the decision reversed before it became public knowledge inside the household, let alone outside it. Charles listened, and then he did something that surprised almost everyone who witnessed it, including, by every account available, Camilla herself. He said he needed time to think, not a promise to fix it. Not an immediate call to his sister demanding an explanation. Time to think from a man who has spent decades being described by those close to him as fiercely, sometimes recklessly protective of his wife against every force that has ever tried to push her out. Something had shifted, and whatever it was, it had started long before that morning in the private office. The hours after that meeting tell you more about the state of that marriage than almost anything that has happened publicly in years. Charles did not defend his wife. Not immediately, not loudly, not in the way he has defended her for the better part of 5 decades against a public that despised her, a press that hunted her and 2 sons who told him to his face not to marry her at all. This was a man who fought that long, ugly war and won it. And on the morning his sister quietly dismantled the last formal title his wife still held, he said almost nothing at all. People close to the household describe him as withdrawn for the rest of that day. Not angry, not defensive, Withdrawn the way a person goes quiet when they are turning something over in their mind that they are not ready to say out loud yet. He canceled one small engagement that afternoon, citing fatigue. Those who know him well say fatigue was almost certainly not the real reason. William, by contrast, said very little publicly and revealed almost nothing privately, which, if you have followed this family closely, is itself a kind of answer. William has spent years being the most disciplined person in that household about controlling his own reactions in front of staff. But two people who were near him that week describe him as noticeably lighter, more relaxed in meetings that had nothing to do with the matter at all. Whatever tension he has carried for years appeared for at least a few days to have eased. Catherine's response was the most careful of all. She said nothing publicly or privately that anyone has been willing to repeat. That silence is itself notable given how closely she has aligned herself with the causes and charities Diana once championed, causes that over recent years have quietly been folded back into her own patronage list as Camilla's public role gradually narrowed. If there was satisfaction in that silence, nobody has been able to prove it, but nobody who knows her has ruled it out either. And then there was Andrew, sitting apart from all of it, technically no longer part of the working family at all, and yet somehow at the center of the entire chain of events. The material connected to his ongoing investigation was never supposed to touch Camilla directly. His case has always been framed publicly around his own conduct, his own choices, his own reckoning. Nobody outside a very small circle expected anything in those files to reach anywhere near her. But somebody did the reading. And what they found reframed a decision that had, until that point, felt entirely unrelated to Anne's decades-old history with Camilla at all. None of them, not Charles, not William, not Catherine, not even Camilla herself in that first stunned hour, yet understood how far back this actually went or how long Anne had been carrying it in silence, waiting for the moment when she finally had something concrete enough to act on. To understand why Anne was the one capable of doing this so cleanly, without hesitation, without needing anybody's permission, you have to go back more than 50 years, long before Diana, long before Charles, long before any of this became a story about a king and his second wife at all. Before Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, Anne and Andrew Parker Bowles were seriously involved, close enough that marriage had genuinely been discussed between them, but Andrew was Catholic and Anne, as a senior member of the Church of England, was not permitted to marry him under the rules of that era. She stepped aside not because she wanted to, but because the institution required it, and she has spent her entire life doing exactly what the institution requires of her, whatever it costs her personally. Camilla moved in within a short time, Andrew proposed, and Anne sat in the pews at their wedding and watched the entire thing happen in public in a hat with photographers outside her face arranged into precisely the expression that was expected of her that afternoon. She never made a scene. She has never made a scene about anything in 50 years. She sat through the service, she attended the reception, and she has never in all that time said one public word about what that day genuinely cost her. That is the woman at the center of this story. Not somebody who reacts, somebody who files things away and waits sometimes for decades until the moment finally arrives where acting costs her nothing and accomplishes everything. Royal biographers have written for years that Camilla was quietly intimidated by Anne, that the coldness between them was never resolved and was never going to be. It was never loud. It was never a feud anyone could photograph. It was a woman who said good morning at every family gathering for 50 years and nothing else ever to anyone who was paying close enough attention to notice the pattern. Andrew and Camilla's marriage did not last. They divorced years later, and by then Camilla had already moved into a very different kind of relationship, one that would eventually unravel Charles's first marriage entirely. But it is what happened in the years immediately following that first wedding, quietly on paper inside correspondence, nobody outside a very narrow circle was ever meant to see, that connects directly to what surfaced recently inside Andrew's investigation files. Anne was not merely a spurned suitor sitting in a church pew that day. She remained close enough to that circle in the years afterward to have seen things most people never did. Private exchanges, informal understandings, the kind of arrangements families like that one have always relied on to keep inconvenient truths contained. For decades, she said nothing. Not because she had forgotten, because saying something before she had proof would have accomplished nothing except making her look bitter. She has never needed to be believed on her word alone. She has only ever needed to be right and to be able to prove it when the moment finally came. This is the part of the story that reframes everything you have heard so far. Somewhere inside the massive paperwork connected to Andrew's ongoing investigation, the trade correspondence, the old diaries, the material investigators have spent months sorting through a set of decades-old letters that had nothing directly to do with Epstein. Nothing to do with the allegations that made headlines around the world. They were older than that. Correspondence from the years immediately following Camilla's first marriage, exchanged between people who moved in the same narrow social circle Andrew Parker Bowles once belonged to. What those letters described, according to what has been quietly relayed since, was an arrangement, financial and formal, the kind of favor one well-connected family does for another and never puts in writing except when the person writing it assumes nobody will ever read it again. An arrangement that benefited Camilla directly during a period when her own finances and her standing within that circle were far more precarious than the public version of her history has ever suggested. None of it was illegal. That distinction matters, and it is worth being precise about it because a lot of channels will tell you otherwise to keep you watching. Nothing in those letters describes a crime. What they describe is a version of events Camilla has spent decades allowing people to believe was different from what actually happened. A quieter, more convenient account of how she survived those early years. One that left out exactly whose help she relied on and what that help may have cost the person who gave it. Anne is named in that correspondence, not as a central figure but present, aware, close enough to the arrangement to have understood precisely what it was at the time it happened. She sat on that knowledge for decades, and then Andrew's case cracked open a set of archives nobody expected to intersect with anything related to Camilla at all, and somebody with the authority to review that material found it. When it reached Anne, according to what is circulated since among people close to the household, she read it, once said very little, and asked for confirmation from someone she trusted to verify it was genuine. Only after that confirmation came back did she request the meeting with Camilla. This is the piece that changes how you should be reading everything that came before it. Anne's decision was never really about a title. The title was simply the only instrument available to her, the one lever she has always had the authority to pull without needing anyone else's permission. What she was actually responding to was decades of watching Camilla control the story of her own past decades of watching the family quietly absorb whatever version of events was easiest to live with, and one piece of paper that finally gave her something she could act on rather than simply carry. Whether Camilla remembers that arrangement the same way the letters describe it is a different question entirely, and one nobody outside that private meeting has an answer to. What is clear is that when Anne asked her about it directly, Camilla did not deny it happened. She simply asked how Anne intended to use it. Anne did not answer that question in the room. She answered it the following morning in the private office in 10 minutes without raising her voice. But removing a title is not the same as resolving what the family now has to decide together. And that decision was no longer Anne's alone to make. Once a piece of information like that exists inside a family like this one, it stops being a private matter almost immediately, whether anyone intends that or not. Within days, the private secretaries were involved, not because anyone announced a crisis, but because a title cannot simply vanish from someone's name without a formal process behind it. And formal processes require paperwork, and paperwork requires people who are paid to notice when something unusual is happening. The legal review was quiet, procedural, almost bureaucratic in tone, which is precisely how the institution prefers to handle anything that could otherwise become a scandal. Patronage removal has a clear internal pathway. It does not require public justification. It does not require the person losing the patronage to consent. It requires only the sign-off of whoever holds the authority to grant it in the first place and confirmation that the process followed protocol. Anne had followed protocol to the letter. That is, by every account, the first thing the private secretaries confirmed. Whatever informal fury Camilla directed at Charles in the hours afterward, there was no procedural error to challenge, no technicality to exploit, no route back to the title through any official channel. What the advisors found themselves managing instead was something harder to control. The question of what happens next institutionally once a decision like this becomes known more widely inside the household. Staff talk. Even the most carefully vetted people repeat things eventually in small pieces to people they trust. Within a week, versions of what had happened were circulating quietly among senior staff. Each one slightly different, none of them containing the full picture, all of them containing enough truth to make everyone nervous about what might eventually reach outside those walls. There was also the matter of succession optics, which is the part advisors care about more than almost anything else. Every decision inside that family gets weighed eventually against the question of how it will look years from now, under a different reign with different people holding the authority Anne currently holds. If Camilla's remaining formal role could be revoked this cleanly, this quietly by one member of the family acting on private information, it raised uncomfortable questions about what precedent that sets for her and for anyone else whose position might one day depend on nobody digging too deeply into the past. Nobody moved to reverse it. That is the detail worth sitting with. Advisors who exist specifically to manage risk and protect the institution's stability looked at what had happened and chose not to intervene. Whether that was because they agreed with Anne's reasoning or simply because reversing a decision already confirmed as procedurally sound would have created more risk than leaving it in place is not something anyone outside that circle has been willing to say clearly. What is clear is that the machinery, once it started moving, did not stop. Files were updated, formal correspondence was quietly revised to remove references to the patronage. The change would not be announced with any fanfare. That is not how these things are ever handled, but it would be reflected eventually in every place where such things are recorded. The machinery had already begun moving, and nothing left to happen next would take place behind closed doors anymore. Institutional decisions stay abstract for exactly as long as nobody outside a small circle has to live with them. That stopped being true within a matter of weeks. The first visible change was the schedule. Engagements that had once carried Camilla's name quietly began appearing under Catherine's office instead, not all at once, not with any explanation attached, but one by one the way these things are always handled inside that family. A hospital visit that had been hers for years, a charitable gala she had chaired since before the coronation. Small things individually, unmistakable as a pattern once you lined them up. Staff reassignments followed the same quiet logic. 2 members of Camilla's private office were moved into roles supporting Catherine's expanding patronage list, officially described as a routine restructuring to meet increased demand. Nobody who worked in that building believed it was routine. Restructuring on that scale that quickly without warning is never routine. It is always a decision made somewhere above the people it affects, communicated only after it has already been finalized. Then came the correspondence. Formal letters that once carried Camilla's full title were quietly reissued using her remaining more limited style. Invitations to certain events stopped listing her among the family's official patrons of specific causes. None of this was announced. None of it needed to be. The people who received those letters noticed immediately, and the people who noticed talked, and within a short time the pattern had become impossible to explain away as coincidence to anyone who was paying attention. The most painful change by every account from people close to the household was the charities themselves. Several organizations Camilla had supported for years, some she had genuinely cared about by all accounts, regardless of what else was happening around her, began receiving communications directly from Catherine's office regarding future collaboration. Nobody told Camilla this was happening before it happened. She found out the way most people in that position eventually find out things secondhand through someone who assumed she already knew. Official websites were updated last as they always are, quietly, without a press notice. The kind of change only someone actively looking for it would ever notice at all. Her biography page was edited to remove the patronage. The wording around her remaining responsibilities was tightened, more formal, less warm than it had been even a few months earlier. Each of these changes on its own could be explained away. Together they told a story nobody in that household needed to say out loud. The woman who had spent decades quietly reshaping the palace around her own preferences was now watching the palace reshape itself around someone else's, one small administrative decision at a time, exactly the way she had once done it to somebody who could no longer speak for herself. Camilla said nothing publicly through any of it. Those close to her describe her as retreating further into private life, during those weeks appearing at only the engagements that remained firmly hers, avoiding anywhere she might be asked a question she had no acceptable answer for. But one final meeting still remained. And this one, unlike the first, neither Anne nor Camilla would be the one sitting across from each other in the room. The conversation everyone inside that household had been quietly waiting for finally happened between Charles and Camilla weeks after the initial meeting, once the institutional changes were already fully underway and could no longer be reversed by anything either of them said to each other. By every account, since it was not an argument, those close to them described something quieter and in its own way harder to sit through, a husband and wife finally saying out loud what both of them had been avoiding since the morning Anne walked out of that private office. Camilla wanted to know why he had not fought for her the way he always had. Why the man who had spent decades absorbing public contempt on her behalf, who had faced down two sons, who begged him not to marry her, who had rebuilt an entire institution's tolerance for her presence, one careful year at a time, had simply gone quiet the one time it mattered most. Charles did not have an easy answer, and by most accounts, he did not pretend to. What he offered instead, according to what has been carefully repeated since, by people who would only describe it in the vaguest terms, was something closer to an admission than a defense. He told her that he had believed her for years about how she survived those early ones, the version of the story she had always told him, the one that left out exactly what Anne's letters described. And when he finally read the material himself quietly before any of this became official, something in him had simply stopped being willing to fight the same fight all over again. That does not mean he stopped loving her. People close to the family are careful to make that distinction, and it appears to be genuine. What changed was smaller and in some ways more permanent than anger. It was the quiet, private understanding that he had spent decades defending a version of his wife that was not entirely accurate, and that he was no longer certain how much of what he believed about their shared history could be trusted the way he once trusted it without question. Camilla, for her part, did not deny what the letters described. She has never denied it, not to Anne and not to Charles. What she reportedly said instead was that it happened a very long time ago, under different circumstances, when she was a very different person with very few options in front of her. Whether that is a full account of what happened or simply the version that is easiest for her to live with now is not something anyone outside that room can answer. The conversation did not reverse anything. The patronage stayed gone. The schedule stayed rewritten. Nothing about the institutional decision changed because two people finally said difficult things to each other in private. That was never how this family works, and both of them, by every account, understood that going into the conversation. What did change was quieter and, in its own way, heavier. Charles stopped defending her publicly with the same conviction he once had. He did not attack her, did not distance himself dramatically, did not do anything the public could point to directly. He simply stopped being the man who fought every battle on her behalf without hesitation. And everyone close to that marriage noticed the difference, even if nobody outside those walls could quite say why. A story like this does not stay behind palace walls indefinitely, no matter how carefully it is managed. It simply takes longer to surface than anyone inside those walls would like, and it arrives sideways through details nobody planned for rather than through any single dramatic leak. It began with a royal correspondent noticing the change on the official website, a quiet edit to Camilla's biography page, the patronage simply no longer listed. On its own, that detail would have meant nothing to most people. But royal watchers who track these things closely noticed it within hours, and one of them posted about it publicly, framing it as a minor curiosity rather than a story. That post was enough. Within a day, other outlets began cross-referencing engagement schedules, noticing the same pattern. The household had watched unfold internally for weeks, Camilla's name quietly absent from events that had carried it for years, Catherine's office listed in her place. Nobody had an official comment. The palace, as it almost always does in situations like this, declined to confirm or deny anything, which only deepened the speculation rather than settling it. Television panels picked it up within days. Commentators who make a living analyzing body language and seating arrangements dissected old footage of Camilla and Anne together, searching retroactively for signs of tension nobody had thought to look for at the time. Royal historians were brought on to explain the mechanics of patronage removal, most of them careful to note that such changes happen periodically and rarely carry deeper meaning, a caveat that did almost nothing to slow the speculation building around this particular one. International coverage followed quickly, framing it through whatever lens each outlet's audience responded to: best a power struggle, a family falling apart, quiet justice finally arriving decades late. Almost none of the coverage had access to the actual reason behind it. The letters, the arrangement, Andrew's investigation files, none of that had surfaced publicly, and it would not through any official channel. What the public was reacting to was the shape of the story, not its substance, and that shape was more than enough to generate weeks of continuous coverage. Public opinion split along familiar lines almost immediately. Some viewed it as further proof that the family had never truly forgiven Camilla, that whatever piece had been publicly performed since the coronation was exactly that, a performance finally cracking under pressure. Others saw it as validation, a long overdue reckoning for a woman many members of the public had never fully accepted, regardless of how many years passed. Diana's name resurfaced almost immediately in the public conversation, the way it always does whenever anything involving Camilla becomes a story. Old interviews were replayed, old quotes recirculated. A comparison the family has spent years trying to move past reasserted itself within days, entirely outside anyone's control. Inside the palace, the reaction to all of this was by every account exhaustion rather than panic. Nothing about the coverage threatened the institutional decision itself. But it meant that a private family matter, one that had taken weeks to unfold quietly behind closed doors, was now something millions of people had an opinion about, whether they understood any part of the real story or not. And one appearance already scheduled long before any of this began was about to make the entire situation visible in a way no commentary panel ever could. The service had been scheduled on the family calendar for months long before any of what happened in that private office at Windsor. A church service, the kind the family attends together every year without exception, cameras positioned exactly where they always are, the walking order, arranged with the same careful precision it always carries. Every other year, Camilla had a fixed place in that procession close to Charles, visible from nearly every angle the cameras favored. This year she was there, but the arrangement around her was different in ways that took most viewers a moment to fully register, and royal watchers considerably less time than that. She walked several steps further back than in previous years. Not dramatically so, nothing that would look like an obvious demotion to someone unfamiliar with how carefully these processions are usually choreographed, but enough that anyone who had watched this same service unfold in exactly the same formation for years noticed immediately that something had shifted. Anne walked near the front as she always does, her expression giving away nothing at all, the same composed stillness she has carried through every public appearance for decades. She did not look toward Camilla once during the entire procession. Not coldly, not pointedly, simply not at all, as though the absence of acknowledgement was its own quiet statement, made without a single word spoken in front of a camera. Charles walked beside Camilla for part of the service, close enough for the optics to suggest unity, but several witnesses who attended in person described something in his posture that photographs alone could not quite capture, a physical distance that had nothing to do with the actual inches between them. Catherine, seated where Camilla might once have expected some overlap in responsibilities, appeared instead in a role that had visibly expanded since the events of recent weeks. She greeted several charity representatives Camilla had once worked with directly by name, with the easy familiarity of someone who had already taken over those relationships in practice, not just on paper. The empty space was the detail that spread fastest once the footage circulated. Not a literal empty pew, Camilla was present, seated, visible throughout. But a seat beside her that had in previous years been occupied by someone from her own extended circle of patronage connections, now filled instead by a junior aide present in an official capacity that had nothing to do with Camilla at all. Nobody said anything publicly during the service. Nobody needed to. The walking order told the story more clearly than any statement could have, the way these things always do, inside that family where nothing meaningful is ever announced and everything meaningful is arranged precisely enough that anyone watching closely understands exactly what they are looking at. Camilla's expression throughout was by every description available composed, practiced. The same expression she has worn through every public difficulty for decades, the one that reveals nothing regardless of what is happening underneath it. But those closest to her say that composure cost her something that day it had never cost her before. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, the distance between the public performance and the private reality had become visible enough that even people who knew nothing about the letters, nothing about Andrew's files, nothing about any of it, could sense that something inside that family had permanently changed. Months later, the story had mostly disappeared from the headlines the way these things always eventually do. New crises arrived to occupy the commentary panels. Other members of the family gave other people something new to speculate about. But inside the palace, nothing about what had actually changed reversed itself, and the people closest to it say it never will. Anne did not gain anything from this beyond the thing she had apparently wanted for 50 years, which was never power or public credit. She gave no interviews, she made no further comment, she returned almost immediately to the same relentless schedule of quiet, unglamorous engagements she has always preferred, the kind that rarely make headlines and never seem to require her to explain herself to anyone. If there was satisfaction in finally settling something she had carried since a wedding decades earlier, she has never shown it and by every account never will. Charles lost something harder to name than a title or a schedule. He lost the uncomplicated certainty he had built his entire second marriage around the belief that he had fought for a version of his wife's history that was entirely true. What remains between them, according to those closest to the marriage, is real but altered, a partnership still standing, but missing something that used to hold it together without effort. Camilla lost the last formal marker of a public role she had spent years quietly expanding, and along with it, something less visible but perhaps more painful. The sense that her past was fully behind her, settled, no longer capable of being used against her by anyone inside her own family. She continues her public duties, scaled back but present, composed in every appearance, the way she has always been. But those close to her describe someone who understands finally that nothing she believed was permanently buried actually was. Catherine gained influence she had not asked for directly, but did not resist accepting, either absorbing patronages and relationships that had once belonged to someone else, continuing a pattern that has quietly defined her role in that family for years now, becoming gradually, and without ever appearing to seek it, the woman the institution increasingly organizes itself around. And William, who said almost nothing publicly through any of it, appears by every account available to have gotten something he had waited a very long time for without ever lifting a hand to bring it about himself. His aunt did what he never needed to do directly. The institution absorbed the consequences without his fingerprints anywhere on the decision. What the monarchy protected in the end was not any single person's reputation. It protected its own procedures, its own quiet mechanisms for managing exactly this kind of crisis without ever having to explain itself to the public that funds it. The letters never surfaced. The full truth never reached outside those walls. What the public saw was a pattern of small administrative changes, easy enough to explain away, impossible to fully understand without knowing what nobody outside a very narrow circle was ever told. Anne had waited 50 years for a piece of paper that finally let her act, and when it came, she used it exactly once in 10 quiet minutes without ever raising her voice, proof that inside a family built entirely on patience, the person who waits longest is usually the one who finally gets to decide how the story ends.